Yes, perfect. Good evening, and thank you for attending our program titled Art History's Best Dressed. Our presenter is art historian Jane Oneail. My name is Elisabeth Angele. I am responsible for information and patron services at the Hamden Public Library. Before I introduce you to our presenter this evening, I would like to do some Zoom keeping and mention some upcoming library programs. Please note that we will record this program. I will send out a follow-up email with the recording link. We also have permission to upload the program to the library's YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Jane. To achieve the best sound quality, everyone will be muted. When you want to participate in the discussion, please unmute yourself. There are different ways to do that. On the microphone icon on the left-hand side of the Zoom toolbar, simply click on that, or hold down the space bar on your computer, or hold down the Alt key and the letter A. Once you have finished sharing your thoughts, please mute yourself again. I would like to mention two upcoming library programs. Join us for a captivating journey through African American history on Tuesday, February 25 at 6:30 p.m. in Thornton Wilder Hall. Jeffrey Fletcher will present the Ruby and Calvin Fletcher African American History Museum, which is located in Stratford, Connecticut. You will have a chance to see unique historical and cultural artifacts up close and personal. The collection was created by his parents, and he thought these items are so unique. He found a building and found co-sponsors and opened this museum in 2021. It's really interesting. And then on Saturday, March 1st at 2 p.m. in Thornton Wilder Hall, we will welcome the author of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott. She will be impersonated by Jan Turnquist, who is a professional actor and the executive director of Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts, where Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women. This event is scheduled in connection with the performance of the musical version of Little Women by the Hamden High School Main Stage Ensemble, which will take place from March 20th to March 22nd in the Hamden High School Auditorium. Please mark your calendars for that. More information will be forthcoming. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our presenter this evening, Jane Oneail. Jane Oneail curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Thank you for presenting this evening, Ms. Oneail.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the great ensembles we're going to be learning about tonight. Tonight's program is really subjective. It's sort of shaped by some of my own preferences, but it will be a feast for the eyes. It will be all sorts of visual splendor over centuries of time, just some of the most gorgeous outfits ever painted. So relax, kick back. You are in for a treat over the next hour or so. So, I want to just give a little bit of a quick preamble before we get started, sort of thinking about how you approach this subject of art and fashion together. We will be getting back to this lovely image on the screen in just a moment, but there's kind of all sorts of ways you could skin this cat. You could think about artists using clothing as canvas. We are actually looking at an image of Madonna herself wearing a skirt that was painted by the graffiti artist turned professional artist, Keith Haring. So here he is using her clothing as his canvas. Other ways to approach this is to consider the sort of interesting interplay between the world of fashion and the world of art. So in this case, we are looking at an Yves Saint Laurent dress from the 1960s that adopts or appropriates this style of painting from the artist Mondrian. So this is known as the Mondrian dress. And of course, over the years, numerous fashion designers have looked to the world of art for inspiration for their designs. So we've got a beautiful Gustav Klimt gold painting over here on the left, and then a gown inspired by the various design motifs that we see over here. And this was done by Alexander McQueen, just a lovely sort of floor-length design here. And I think one that Klimt himself would have been proud of. Now, in the past few decades, this relationship between art and fashion design, I think, has gotten even cozier. Back in 2013, in fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Art hosted a full exhibition of Alexander McQueen's designs in these very sort of carefully curated, very elaborate spaces. So all of a sudden, art is coming off of the runway and into museum galleries. And this was a record-breaking exhibition for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So since then, we've certainly been seeing more of this cross-pollination, probably most recently in recent memory. Most of us can recall the Fashion by Sargent exhibit that was in Boston and London, where we could see some of Sargent's most famous paintings right alongside the fashions that his subjects wore. And I think people really love to see the way those two things kind of look side by side. Beyond that, still, we're kind of newly interested in the sartorial choices of some of our favorite artists. And I think especially when it comes to women artists, we think of their clothing choices as an extension of their creative choices. So it's not unusual to go to a Georgia O'Keeffe exhibition these days and see her work on the wall and her very own clothes on mannequins right alongside the work. And if we push this just one step further, these days you don't even need to see Frida Kahlo's work on display. It's her fashion that actually goes on touring exhibitions that are still sold out shows. Frida Kahlo was such a successful artist in fashioning this identity that I think so many people gravitate towards, that people want to go and just sort of see this persona that she's so carefully crafted. So so there's just an installation view on the right of some of Frida Kahlo's clothes. So how are we going to approach this subject tonight? Let me give you a sense of how we'll spend our time together. We are going to get started looking at some stunning silhouettes, the big picture there, and then move from hats to headwear to velvet and fur, silk, satin, lace collars, ribbons, ruffles, and frills. The idea here is that we're kind of like removing a layer of clothing as we go through each section of tonight's program, getting a little bit more intimate as we go along. So here we are back to that image that I had on the title slide, and this is a gorgeous painting, Mrs. Carl Meyer, by the artist John Singer Singer Sargent. This is right before the turn of the 20th century. And she is wearing an absolutely delicious pink dress here with this velvet tie, kind of cinching her waist here with another black velvet ribbon at her elbows here. And one of the details that astonishes me every time I zero in on this picture, and I'm actually going to try to zoom in on it for you, is we can see that she's got a couple strands of pearls around her neck here, another strand, or perhaps it's the same strand, but it sort of dips down towards her waist. But as we zoom in, perhaps you can see that that long strand actually goes all the way down to her tiny little kitten heels there. So it's pretty, it's prominent. It's easy to see when you see it in person, but it's a subtle detail here. And we get to sort of drink in John Singer Sargent's just buttery brushstrokes here as well. So I use John Singer Sargent to kind of punctuate almost every section of tonight's program. We will be heading through the centuries, as I mentioned, with a primary focus on the 1500s through the 1800s, but John Singer Sargent creeps up with each of these categories. So let's get started now with some stunning silhouettes. And we're going to go back to the 1500s here. We have two images of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII was well, you can surmise from both of these images. He was a leader who was very much interested in his own fashion. And he had all of the power, the wealth, the money to hire the best fashion designers of the day and the best artists of the day to memorialize him wearing these costumes. Now, Henry VIII took it one step further. He didn't want anybody to look as good as he did. So he created all of these sumptuary laws. One of those laws was that he was the only one who could wear this color purple, this little sash that we see tied around his waist in the image on the left. I should mention that both of these images were painted by the artist Hans Holbein the Younger, or his workshop. Some of these incredible details that we see on the left are definitely the hand of the artist. Now, the big overwhelming idea here is that Henry VIII is wearing these clothes that make him look so wide, so broad. This is his stunning silhouette, and he accentuates that over here on the right with this really wide stance here too. This is a pretty unusual way to stand for a formal portrait at the time. I think these days we'd call it a power pose, right? So here he is wearing all of these layers too. We can see that he's got a fur-lined doublet on, but really the emphasis here is on kind of revealing those layers through the clothing. So these are what are called slashed sleeves here with the cuffs, so that he's actually sort of pulling out the linen from underneath to kind of reveal these layers. This is when Europe's kind of coming out of a little ice age at the time too. So you would need these layers. But this was a great way for him to effectively show his power. You know, he's a big guy here. It's like the equivalent of the 80s power suit with the big shoulder pads in it. So not to be outdone, his contemporary Francois I, just across the English Channel there in France, was doing just about the same thing. And this fantastic portrait of him that's at the Louvre, painted by the artist Jean Clouet, is so wide, is so broad, it can't even be contained by the panel that it's painted on. His giant clothes sort of expand out beyond it. And we can see in this case, it's kind of the same idea. It's multiple layers, it's kind of revealing clothes through those layers. In this case, it's not the slashed sleeves. It is it's like these pinned sleeves. It's open seams essentially, so that you can peer through the clothing. And of course, he's looking very pleased with himself, very shrewd. This was a leader who was very concerned about appearances. Now, if you're interested in royal history, you might already know about the meeting of these two leaders. They got together in 1514. This is sort of an imagined rendering of this event, but it was a very lavish event with jousts and performances and tents made out of silk and golden thread. You can just glimpse them up here at the top of the canvas alongside the dragon. But I think that this might be the first documented instance of glamping, but it came to be known, the event came to be known as the Field of Gold Cloth. So power is expressed through luxury textiles, and you can probably just make out King Henry VIII kind of parading in here in the foreground. Now, big sleeves continue to reign throughout the century, and we are now looking at two images of Elizabeth I of England. These date to roughly the 1580s, the 1590s. And once again, we have a really impressive silhouette here. If somebody was wearing something like this and walked into the room, they would be commanding attention. And part of the way she achieves this is with these giant sleeves. This is a new shape for us, and it's referred to as a leg of mutton sleeve. It has this big puff near the shoulder, and then it tapers right down to the wrist. And you can see that her bodice is shaping her torso to kind of echo that form. So it's quite a stunning silhouette. And we can also see with these two portraits that there's a number of other details being included to signify her position and her authority globally. I mean, over here on the left, she's standing on a map or on the surface of the globe. Over here, she's just touching one, and in the back, we can see her armada. Now, there's so many other fantastic details to what she's wearing here, from the strands of pearls to these lace collars, but we'll be kind of delving into lace collars along the way. For now, we can just kind of feast our eyes on all of those splendid details, but really the takeaway is this stunning silhouette of hers. Now, as we move forward through time into the Baroque, into the 1600s, we are going to consider a work by the Spanish artist Diego Velázquez. And this is a little girl that you've probably seen before, the Infanta Margarita Teresa. This was painted in 1659. She's probably about 8 years old. You might remember her from Velázquez's most famous painting that we see over here, the Las Meninas, from just a couple of years before, when the Infanta was about 5 years old. So we can see in the years since Velázquez's masterpiece, the Infanta's gotten bigger, and so has her dress. And in fact, as she gets older and older, the width of that dress continues to grow, so much so that she can't even extend her own arms past the edges of her dress. And yes, something like this would have been very difficult to move around in. And we can see that the design of this blue velvet dress over here is meant to accentuate the kind of strange proportions of it too. Strange to us, right? So she's got this kind of metallic border along the top and along the bottom. The structure underneath her skirt here is meant to create this kind of square shape underneath the dress. Now, this hoop skirt structure is known as a farthingale, and it's the farthingale sort of starts off as a round structure. And of course, over time into the 1600s, it was the height of fashion to have it look like this rectangle. And the end result here is this tiny little waist, or at least the illusion of one. Of course, she's 8, so she does have a tiny little waist. And it functioned as a type of kind of social armor for the people that wore it. Also in that it really restricted their movement. Now, there were a lot of men in Spanish society that had criticisms of this style of clothing. They referred to it as a church bell dress, or they called the women who wore them turtles. But this style earned an interesting nickname in Spain, and I'll try not to butcher the pronunciation. It was referred to as a guarda infante, and there was a myth sort of surrounding it that women could hide a pregnancy under a dress like this. I'm not quite sure human anatomy works that way, but these dresses were actually even outlawed in 1639. That only served to make them more popular. So as we move along through history, and as we're still considering these stunning silhouettes, we have the opportunity to feast our eyes on none other than Marie Antoinette. And she's wearing a fairly similar looking dress. And this is about 100 years later. So here she is, the Queen of France. She's just 22 years old when Vigée Lebrun painted her portrait here in 1778. And we can see that she's wearing a very wide dress. It has all of these beautiful sort of bunches of fabric. There's these golden tassels, the lace sleeves, and this particular style of dress, even though it's just a little bit different, has a completely different kind of structure underneath it. The French would call this the robe à la française or a sack dress. This was a court dress. This was the only thing that was appropriate to wear if you're going to be seen out in the Palace Versailles. In this case, we can see that she is dressed to the nines for this formal portrait here, and there are all sorts of references to her power with the crown over here on the right, and the sculpture of her husband, the king, over here on just above it. Now, what's kind of interesting about this dress is that even though we can imagine it would be very difficult to move in, there's some things about it that are kind of amazing. This is a dress that really took up space and it allowed women to kind of claim space for themselves. Some women actually even felt freer wearing a dress like this because apparently it made it just a little bit more difficult for men to brush up against them. So there's a little bit of liberation in claiming all of that space. Now, our next work is quite a contrast. We are looking at a gown that is all about the contours of the female form. And in this case, we're looking at the famous painting of Madame X by John Singer Sargent, painted in 1884. Now, Madame X, whose real name was Madame Gautreau, wears a black evening dress here with a heart-shaped bodice made out of velvet, and it comes down into this dramatic long point in the front. And this is a black satin skirt that she's wearing. So the color of the dress creates this very striking contrast with the subject's very pale skin, and her only adornments, other than the dress, are well, along with the dress, are these decorative straps to the dress. There's a little half moon shape in her hair, and she is wearing a wedding ring too. She is all curves here. This is very va-va-voom, but there was a lot of contemporary criticism of this painting. One of the criticisms was actually the fit of the bodice, that it seemed to be a little bit too far away from her body. The biggest criticism, of course, though, was the strap, because as it was originally painted, John Singer Sargent had one of those decorative straps kind of coming over her shoulder, and people lost their minds about it. They thought it was just over the top in terms of its sensuality. One critic wrote, "One more struggle and the lady will be free." So there's this idea that she could just kind of slither right out of this dress, when in fact that bodice was made out of metal and whalebone, and it wasn't going anywhere. Those straps were purely ornamental. So the public's vitriol for this painting was really unexpected to the subject, Madame Gautreau, and the artist, John Singer Sargent. He ended up repainting that strap in the way that we see it finished over here on the right, in a very feeble attempt to repair his reputation. Now, we'll be seeing more from him before the end of the night. Our last stunning silhouette is this one here, painted by the artist Georges Seurat. This is really his most famous masterpiece, called Sunday on La Grande Jatte, painted from 1884 to 86. This is one of the most famous objects in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. It's known for its striking beauty, its grand scale, and its special cameo in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's painted in a pointillist style, meaning it is essentially just painted with small, controlled dots of paint. You can even see that the frame is painted that way. It's a pleasant scene of leisure in a park along the Seine River just outside of Paris. It looks like a nice sunny day. There are dozens of figures lounging, fishing, interacting with each other. For our purposes, we're just going to focus on this prominent woman on the right over here who has a monkey on a leash. That is one striking silhouette, is it not? Many have argued that the woman is likely a prostitute with a wealthy married man. This type of courtesan was was known as a demi-mondaine in late 19th century Paris, and that basically translates to like between two worlds. These half-world women lived outside of the range of normal kind of respectability, but they were a tremendously visible part of society, and they were well funded because they had essentially very rich boyfriends who would make sure that they were dressed in the latest fashion. So you can imagine this woman is almost like promenading in this park to show off the latest style. And what was the latest style at the time was this enormous bustle. Take a look really closely. You can see it's almost as though Georges Seurat couldn't stop adding these little pointillist dots to this woman's very large rear end here. Now, what's kind of fascinating to me is that the bustle style really started right around the time he started the painting, and we can see it over the course of various studies, just getting bigger and bigger and bigger until 1886 when he finished the painting. And at that point, as one critic you could essentially place a tray with a teapot on it on the woman's rear end. It's hard to imagine sitting in something like this, right? But that sort of represents the end of the bustle mania as well. So we have a great sense in terms of these wild, striking silhouettes that have caught our eyes over the centuries, from, the big shoulders to the big rear ends. Now we're going to zero in on different types of headwear and then different types of fabric, really. So hats and headwear. We're going to start off with this beautiful work, this crisp, delicate veil here. This is a painting that's simply called Portrait of a Lady, painted by the artist Roger van der Weyden from 1460. This is at the National Gallery of Art. Now, in the 15th century, veils were typically worn for modesty. You're trying to cover up a little bit and hide the sensuality of flesh here. But in this work, the veil sort of has the opposite effect. This woman's face is framed in such a lovely way by this headdress that is calling attention to her beauty, draws our attention right to her eyes there. She's got this long, thin face. She's got plucked eyebrows and eyelashes and eyelids. She's even got a plucked hairline here to create this fashionably high forehead. Now, just beyond that, she has a velvet headband on, and then her hair is tightly pulled back and arranged in this cylindrical kind of stack and that turret is being held together with what's called a crispin. And then you can probably just make out these two little dots here. Those are the hairpins that are keeping this beautiful veil in place, and it spreads out across her shoulders, creating this really kind of gorgeous frame for her face and for her body. I love the details here of how you can still see the folds of this thin drapery here spreading out around her. It's just so striking. So it does such a great job of calling attention to her head and face. We'll see the same is true for this next hat here as well. This image comes to us by way of the Dutch Baroque master Rembrandt, and we can see why he is a master here. This is a great example of how especially talented Rembrandt was at capturing different textures. And it was a primary focus for him, especially at the beginning of his career. This was one of his favorite models, perhaps even his father, somebody that he used frequently around the early 1630s. This is simply called Old Man with a Gold Chain. This is also at the Art Institute of Chicago. So in keeping with tastes of the time, he's wearing all these very dark colors, muted colors, reminds us that Rembrandt was painting at the same time roughly as when the Pilgrims came to America. But it's also a good reminder for us thinking about fashion that these black dyed clothes would have been the most expensive kinds of clothes that you could get at the time because it took a lot of dye to actually saturate the fabric. So we can see that Rembrandt is focused on the velvet of the cloak, on the metal of this gorget. We've got a pearl earring here as well, and two ostrich feathers to top off this kind of undulating Renaissance style cap that his subject is wearing. It creates a wonderful pyramidal composition here and frames his subject's face in such a wonderful way, casting a little bit of shadow there over the eyes, drawing us in even further. Rembrandt himself would don several of these caps over the years and create some of his very famous self-portraits with them. So we're thinking about hats and headwear now. So we're actually going to turn our attention now to a different kind of headwear, and that is the powdered wig. We are looking at a portrait of Charles de France, the Duc de Berry. He was the grandson of Louis XIV, and he's painted by an artist named Nicolas Lagillière right around 1710. What a wig, right? Now, the origin stories for wigs, you can find all sorts of different ones, but they usually trace back to some monarch that was prematurely balding and feeling a little self-conscious about it. So he would start to wear wigs, and then the people around him would start to wear wigs. And powdering a wig, like Charles here, was a way to suggest nobility. Or in a military setting like this, notice this gleaming armor that he's wearing. It's a way to suggest authority and decorum. Now, the powder also had a practical purpose. It could be used to absorb oils, odors, all the things in a wig that you just wouldn't want to have to deal with otherwise. So the powder was often concocted out of wheat flour or dried white clay. And that alone could weigh several pounds. And according to one art historian, these powdered wigs had to be powdered several times in like one evening out. So you would have your own personal valet who is powdering you throughout an event. Now, by the 1680s, this middle part in the wig became the norm, and wigs just kept getting higher and higher. So you'd have this dramatic part, and commoners started wearing wigs. And so the nobility had to sort of set themselves apart by making higher, taller, and more elaborate wigs. To this day, we still refer to people in power as bigwigs, right? So every time you look at them, though, you kind of have to imagine just how unwieldy they were and potentially what they might have smelled like and how heavy they might have been too. So we'll wrap up this look at headwear with this one last hat, and it is a doozy, isn't it? This is Lady Georgiana Cavendish, painted by the preeminent English portrait painter Thomas Gainsborough in 1785. She was the great, 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 great granddaughter of Princess Diana. I think I got the number of greats right. She also was kind of rejected by her husband. She embraced society life. She had this kind of frenetic lifestyle. And she became a leader in fashion. She was kind of central to society life, really, and became this kind of popular, sought-after figure in her own right. In this picture, we see her depicted with this incredibly large black hat. It's like Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat, like on steroids in some ways, right? She actually designed this hat specifically for this portrait. It's a large scale hat that could kind of not crush her hairdo, it just perch up there at this nice jaunty angle, and she's wearing it in such a way that it frames her face in this wonderful, striking way. It draws our attention to, I think, this rather confident gaze that she has here. So the hat itself really caught on. It became the style of the day. It's known as a picture hat or a Gainsborough hat. And we have Georgiana Cavendish to thank for it. Also, of course, Thomas Gainsborough. So the hat caught on, and certainly the portrait painting did as well. For now, we are going to shift gears and turn our attention to velvet and fur. I always just am amazed by artists who can capture these kinds of materials with their paintbrushes, with their oil paints in particular. We are going to start off by considering another portrait by Rembrandt. This is his portrait of a man named Nicholas Rutz from 1631. This is in the collection of the Frick. And Rutz here is wearing this fine sable-lined gown that's known as a tabard. It was an article of clothing, sort of an old-fashioned one that was associated with learning and tradition, but that's not who he was, really, despite this little piece of paper in his hand. It might not come as any big surprise to learn that the man depicted here was somebody who was a fur trader. So what we see here, this sable-lined tabard that he's wearing, is made from this little weasel-like animal that has this thick worm fur. And not only was it used for making clothes, it was also used for making artist paintbrush. So I think that there's almost like an affinity here between the artist and the subject to a certain degree. Now, sables are not native to Europe, so you have to go sort of far afield to get them. Not surprisingly, that includes going to Russia, and that would explain why Nicholas Frutz here is wearing this Ushanka hat. So a lot of details about the man's life just from the outfit that he's wearing for the portrait. We are going to turn our attention now to another great Dutch Baroque painter, and that is the artist Vermeer. Now, Vermeer only painted about 35 works in his entire life, that we know of, I should say. And 6 of those 35 works feature women wearing this yellow coat. That's pretty incredible, isn't it? Now, the coat is edged and perhaps lined with ermine fur. And an ermine is like another kind of little weasel type animal. You can get them in Europe and also further afield. And their winter coat is basically all white with a little black on the tail. So in order to get this much ermine fur, you can imagine it would take a lot of ermine to actually be able to line this coat. Now, the yellows are a little bit different, but if you look really carefully at the placement of the spots on these jackets, to me, it's pretty clear that it's the same jacket. Look at this long spot here, kind of corresponding to this long spot over here. And in fact, after Vermeer passed away, there was an inventory of his possessions, and it included a description of a lemon yellow morning jacket like this. Now, back in Vermeer's time, only the richest people on the planet, royalty essentially, would have ermine-lined clothing like this. And I hate to spoil the idyllic vision of these beautiful women sitting at the table here, but for average folk like us to wear something like this, it was imitation. And oftentimes those little spots were made from cat fur or from mice. It sort of ruins the vision of it, doesn't it? But allows us to sort of understand how elaborate pieces of clothing like this have ended up in paintings such as this one. Now, I have one more painting for you by the artist Nicolas Lagillière. And in this case, we're not considering the wig, but we're considering the fur. And I had to wear a little bit of leopard tonight myself. I mean, if you were talking about best dressed, you gotta bring something to the table, right? So in this case, we have another man in a powdered wig wearing this very shiny armor that's never looks like it's never seen a day on the battlefield. But in this case, adding the leopard skin sort of changes things. The leopard skins were oftentimes associated with royalty and nobility, particularly in European art, and its presence on a subject like this one could signify the subject's high status, his royal connections, and more often his worldliness. This suggests that this man has traveled great distances. In this context, the leopard skin suggests kind of martial skill or battlefield victories. This is the idea of the man who has hunted successfully and acquired exotic animals along the way. So there's strength and courage. and a sense of sensuality that goes along with a leopard skin kind of draped about him this way. And let's face it, in the end, it just makes him look extra fancy. So, mission accomplished. Now, continuing on with furs and velvets, we get a little bit of both with this next portrait, once again, of Marie Antoinette. And once again, the artist here is Vigée Lebrun. This is a 9-foot tall portrait from 1788. This is at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And here she is clad in this rich royal blue. And this is a dress that is also lined in sable, as is her petticoat. So you can probably just make out the fur here. This is a slightly different style of dress than we saw with the big court dress that she was wearing before. This is a little bit more informal. It was known as a robe à la levité. It's probably designed for her when she first got pregnant, and maybe even something that that was related to her designs for riding horses. Apparently, she was a very accomplished equestrian, and sleeves like this in particular would have really worked for her riding side saddle. Now, Marie Antoinette really understood the power of fashion, and she had a personal fashion designer named Rose Bertin, and they would meet essentially every day. Rose Bertin would help to get her dressed, and they would have these kind of tete-a-tetes where they would talk about styles and gowns and what was forthcoming. And these designs that Bertin would make for her would often cost 20 times what an average French citizen might make in the year. But this was the Queen's primary mode of communication. People saw what she wore, and this was how she could express who she was at the time. Bertin became incredibly wealthy, incredibly popular, and in order to showcase her work, she would actually make little doll-sized versions of these dresses and put them in like a trunk and travel around with them. I just love the kind of history that goes along with some of these dresses. We round out this section of our program with one last John Singer Sargent, in this case, an exceptional painting of velvet. This is his painting of Mrs. Hugh Hammersley from 1892. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a 7-foot tall portrait of a seated woman here, and it is a knockout. At the time that it was painted, it was called the apotheosis of fashionable painting. And that wasn't necessarily a compliment. People took issue with this. So we see that Mrs. Hugh Hammersley is adorned in this cascading red velvet dress that kind of puddles on the floor in the foreground here and expands out beyond the frame of the painting. This velvet was then, as it is now, a very expensive fabric. It was used in the winters to keep people warm. And Sargent's handling of the paint here and his use of this like mauve color to suggest the sheen of the velvet, I think, is just breathtaking. It also helps to sort of suggest the structure of the dress too, with these kind of crisscrossing lines here. So to add to the splendor, there's embroidered gold down here at the bottom and this kind of gossamer gold collar about her neck. It's just absolutely dazzling, I would say. But male critics of the day referred to the dress as decadent and violent, and they said that the color was one shade away from being terrible. So it's hard for us, I think, in our contemporary eyes to imagine any objections to something like this. It's certainly a painting that has withstood the test of time and changing fashion sense. So we turn our attention now to silk and satin. We can kind of take off the heavy furs and velvets and get a little bit more comfortable. Maybe. I absolutely love this double portrait here. This comes to us by way of the Flemish Baroque artist Anthony van Dyck. This is a double portrait of Lord John Stuart and his brother, Lord Bernard Stuart. This was made in 1638, and the work is at the National Gallery in London. Now, truth be told, this painting always makes me chuckle. It's just so over the top. They look so arrogant, especially Bernard over here. The haughty expression, the sort of peacocking with the outfit. These boys were only 17 and 18 years old, but they just kind of ooze this kind of aristocratic superiority in this picture. And it's all done through fashion, really. The brothers are wearing these contrasting satin doublets and breeches, satin-lined short cloaks here, high collars, and with these lavish lace scallops on them. Notice that they also have high-heeled boots on, and there's more lace with the hose that is designed to kind of fold over the top of those boots. Now, the expensive materials certainly underscore the impressive appearance these young men sought to convey with a portrait like this one. Now, our next image here is actually our first religious painting of the evening. We don't often associate fine textiles with biblical stories, but here we go. This is a portrayal of the story of Judith and Holofernes by the artist Eglin Hendrik Vanderneer from 1678. This work is at the National Gallery of Art. Judith was a beautiful Jewish widow who saves her people by seducing and beheading Holofernes, who was an Assyrian general laying siege to her city. This is a surprisingly bloodless beheading, even though we can see in the background that the deed has already been done. There is Holofernes' head. This is Judith's maidservant who helped her out with the whole event. Instead, our artist here focuses on the seduction part of this event, which would have happened by way of this gorgeous princess cut gown that she's wearing. And this is satin. She is wearing a dress in a style that would have been very popular in the 17th century when it was painted, certainly not when Judith was actually alive. The bodice, the folds of the skirt, and the long banded sleeves here have this gorgeous shimmer to them. It's sort of glinting like that sword in Judith's hand. In the end, Vanderneer seems to have become more occupied with capturing the qualities of the satin rather than the biblical story's narrative elements. But we can all be distracted by a great outfit, can't we? Now, this next dress here is another knockout. This is a silky gown for us to consider, worn by the future Madame Monet. This is the 1866 painting by the preeminent French Impressionist artist Claude Monet before he found his signature style of visible, loose, broken brushstrokes. Monet made this life-size painting of his 18-year-old lover, Camille Danciot. He was just 25 years old when he painted this. Now, both the artist and his muse were desperately poor at the time, so in this case, the dress is probably borrowed. And perhaps that's why this 7.5-foot tall painting was allegedly painted in just 4 days. They had to get that dress back to whoever owned it. But his treatment of the fabrics here, the silk with its hint of stiffness and the gleaming colors, even the warm fur, it recalls the portraiture of earlier artists like the Vermeer and the Rembrandts that we've seen. Camille herself is surprisingly contemporary and convincingly real here, like a modern woman. In fact, the vertical striping was very current in terms of the fashion at the time. And you do get this wonderful sense of movement and the stiffness of that fabric. The fact that it trails outside of the frame of the picture too, I think really suggests that Camille is walking through this space, kind of pausing in this dramatic moment, and then we'll move on. So we get the sense of this moment in time, sort of giving us a little glimpse in terms of where Monet's career is heading to. So we wrap up our look at silks and satins with one last painting here. And of course, it's a John Singer Sargent. So this is Mrs. Cecil Wade, painted from 1886. This is now in the Nelson Atkins Museum. After the scandal caused by the Madame X painting that we saw earlier, the artist lost a lot of clients in France, and so he relocated to England in search of new commissions. Mrs. Wade here is just 23 years old when she sat for John Singer Sargent. She was in her London home, and she's wearing this white satin gown that she wore to be presented to the Queen. Sargent is focusing on this contrast of light and dark here between the gown and this kind of shadowy interior here. And he does this virtuoso work in terms of suggesting the material of the gown. We can see these bold, confident brushstrokes that that seem to kind of resolve themselves as you step away from the painting. That is the magic to John Singer Sargent's paintings. The form-fitting bodice here and this endless skirt, it almost seems like she's accompanied by her skirt here. She's got the sparkling bracelets, a choker, and a white fan all come together so effectively to convey Mrs. Wade's kind of statuesque physique here, and also her elevated social status. It's a knockout. So now we are drilling down one more layer, and I think this is one of our last layers. We've got our lace and our collars here. So get ready for a lot of starch. We are looking at two images here by the artist Franz Porbus the Younger. And you can see that he really kind of specialized in painting these intricate lace collars. This was right around the year 1600. This is Elizabeth of France, the Queen of Spain, over here on the left. And this is Isabella Clara Eugenia of Austria. And I have to say, I just kind of love this expression on her face. That's how I would feel if I was constrained by a giant ruff collar like this. This one's actually called a cartwheel ruff because it's just so big, and it actually had this special propping to kind of keep it at this angle here. Can you imagine trying to navigate through the world without being able to see your feet or really anything that's around you? So you get this kind of stiff, prickly sense of these collars here as we look at these two particular images. The next slide I want to share with you is the only sculpture that I have in the program, but it's a great stiff collar, isn't it? This is a marble bust of Maria Barberini, done by the artist Giuliano Finelli, created in 1627. This is in the collection of the Louvre. I don't know how an artist turns stone to lace, but that is what we're seeing here. He does this without the use of machines or computers. He just had a hammer and a chisel. What a technical achievement. Every texture here rendered in the sculpture is extraordinary, but the lace collar is a knockout. This is a Marie de Medici style collar that stands upright on the back of the neck and kind of folds open, framing the face in such a lovely way. We have these tiny, regularly sized and spaced holes in that collar. The technical achievement of punctuating the stone but not breaking it off is just mind-boggling. In this case, the stiffness of the collar has found its perfect material to suggest it. Now, as we move along through time, stiff collars fade out of fashion, and we begin to see what are called ruff collars or slightly fallen collars. We've got a Rembrandt here that gives us this absolutely gorgeous linen collar here. This is a portrait of a preacher named Johannes Utenberg, and it's done in 1633. This is at the Rijksmuseum. Apparently, this preacher was a little bit combative, and he only posed for Rembrandt for one day. So Rembrandt sort of gives over the rest of the picture to these shadows, to these darker tones, and he asks us to zero in on the preacher's face. The ruff collar helps us do that. We can see the preacher's humanity suggested here with these red-rimmed eyes, the wrinkles on his face, and then the folds of this ruff collar kind of complementing that. Now, it would have taken dozens of yards of fabric to achieve this look. Sometimes it's an accordion fold, sometimes it's a figure 8 fold, but it was a very elaborate sort of extension of what somebody could wear. These things were like laundered separately, starched separately, but they were a status symbol at the time. And eventually these slightly fallen collars evolve into the flat collar like we see here. And this is such a strange and wonderful painting that we're looking at. This is also painted by Anthony van Dyck. This is a triple painting of Charles I. And we can see that he has portrayed the king here in 3 different poses. It's sort of like a huddle of one, or it's sort of like being in a dressing room with mirrors so that you can see yourself from all different perspectives. In this case, the painting was a commission to help support an Italian artist who was going to do a sculpture of the king. That sculpture doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But we can see in all three portraits that Van Dyck has created these beautiful individualized collars for the king. The fallen collar allows for something new in terms of fashion, and that is longer hair. And the king is actually sporting this particular fashion where one side of his hair is much longer than the other. But just drink in the details of these fallen collars and the facile way, or seemingly facile way, that the artist has suggested things like flowers and insects, and even the transparency of these lace collars here as well. It's really a tour de force. So we wrap up this section with two more sergeants, and these were both done right around the turn of the century. These are both in private collections. On the left, we have Winifred, the Duchess of Portland, and on the right, this is Mrs. Leopold Hirsch. So Winifred over here is looking absolutely statuesque, standing alongside this Ionic column. She's wearing this silk gown here and looks about 9 feet tall. Now, Sargent has rendered this kind of stiff collar about her shoulders with this flurry of impressionist brushstroke here. And it brings this kind of outdated or old-fashioned style into the modern era, and certainly brings attention to his subject's beautiful face. Over here, Mrs. Leopold Hirsch was a collector of antique textiles, and I think he portrays that, or at least suggests that so well with the fashion that she's wearing. She is wearing a dress, a very low cut dress with a long flat collar, lace collar that hangs down almost to her elbows here. Through it, we can see the pink brocade that she's wearing, which is over yet another layer of lace just underneath it. So Sargent has this great way of suggesting these older styles and bringing them into the modern era. Everything that's old is new again, or at least Sargent can make it look that way. So we wrap up tonight with one last section here. This is on ribbons, ruffles, and frills. And we are going to begin this section with this world-famous painting called The Swing from Jane Oneail Fragonard. This was painted in 1767. It's at the Wallace Collection in London. And this is a picture that is all about ribbons and ruffles. In this picture, we can see this tiny woman in a sumptuously ruffled peach pink gown rising high on a swing in a private wooded setting here. Notice the tall fence in the background. Now, swinging was one of several outdoor activities that were common among the elites, and there were a lot of sort of openly made associations between, the rhythmic exercise of swinging and other rhythmic exercises that might get your heart rate up too. So we see her skirts are suspended in mid-flight here, and she kicks off her little shoe to provide this kind of upskirt view to her boyfriend who is hidden below. Notice the undulating lines in the hem of her skirt are echoed in the branches of the tree above. The entire effect here is soft, it's curvilinear, it's private, it's very intimate. Now, if we zoom in on this dress for just a moment, we can see Fragonard's painting freezes the dress in midair, and it kind of opens up like a flower, revealing the wonderful layers and structure to the robe à la Française that she's wearing. There are also multiple layers of frilly lace at her elbows here. This piece that goes that is on her torso is called a stomacher, and it has a ruffle at the bottom of the hem of her dress and a ribbon around her throat. The painting is a brilliant portrayal of this dress in midair and a titillating way of presenting a fashionable dress of the day. Now, really, nothing is more fashionable than this lady here. This is Madame de Pompadour wearing her iconic green dress, painted right around the same time as the swing. The artist here is Francois Boucher. Now, Madame de Pompadour was the beautiful mistress of King Louis XV of France, and she is depicted at the height of her courtly influence here. She once famously said, "Every day I wish to make the world more beautiful than I found it." And the dress here tells us exactly how she plans to do that. This is what the kids these days would call being very extra. There's just a lot of decoration and ornamentation here. So this is a green silk robe à la française with coordinating petticoat. We oftentimes think of petticoats as being something that goes underneath a dress. At this time, a petticoat was simply the skirt, the coordinating skirt. And all of this is adorned with these little tiny pink roses and pink bows everywhere. Now, silk in France was essentially the best quality silk ever at this time. And it was very tightly woven silk called taffeta to make this particular dress, because otherwise all of this ornamentation would have frayed the silk. So in order to sustain it, so this really gorgeous, tightly woven silk, we're going to zoom in on a detail of Madame de Pompadour, because on her stomacher here, we can see this descending row of bows. If you have really good eyes, those pink bows actually have tiny little green coordinating stripes on them too. But to add the bows to the stomacher was her influence. This is like fashion history being made right here. And this came to be known as an échelle. Notice too, at her elbows, there's like something like 4, 5, 6 different layers of fabric, at least 3 in lace, several more of the backing of the dress, more bows there as well. There's real flowers in her hair and at the corsage here. It just kind of goes on and on and on. The whole look is very soft, extremely frilly, very feminine, but was it comfortable? That's a different story, and it brings us back actually one more time to Marie Antoinette. This is a 1783 painting of the Queen, once again by Vigée Lebrun. And now we see the Queen in a whole new way. That giant court dress that she was wearing before that takes up all that space, it's gone. This is informal. This is intimate. This is a major departure, right? So this is the Queen kind of trying on a popular style at the time. And in doing so, she helps to establish a major trend. She is wearing a loose fitting chemise, similar to the chemise undergarment that most women of the day would have worn under a fancy dress. But this chemise, it has a waistline, it has a full skirt, it has these kind of bunch sleeves here that can be gathered in these small puffs. Now, the people of France did not like to see the Queen in anything that looked like her underwear, and this painting actually had to be removed from public display immediately. The people of France were kind of mortified by it, but it still had a fashionable impact. And in fact, in the years to follow, you can see the very fashionable women of the day adopting that same look that the Queen had sported. It became the style. So over and actually became known as chemise à la reine, the dress of the Queen, essentially. So this is another Vigée Lebrun painting over here on the left. And over here on the right is a painting by Antoine Vestier from 1785. This is in a collection in Brazil. We can see the emphasis on a rather simple white garment with coordinating bows and ribbons, beautiful silk ribbons, I should mention too. But the overall effect was at least an aim for the kind of simplicity that the Queen was wearing in her portrait. So we'll wrap up our look at ribbons and bows with one last John Singer Sargent, and this is a favorite for so many, myself included. This is Lady Agnew of Lochnaw, painted in 1892. This is part of the Royal or the National Galleries in Scotland. So Lady Agnew has this direct gaze and this kind of informal pose that I think brings us right into the painting. And this style of dress that she's wearing emphasizes this relaxed and confident appearance that she has. We're struck by this beautiful flowing fabric that she's wearing and this confidently executed sash that John Singer Sargent kind of dashes off, emphasizing her tiny little waist. Doesn't it look like he just pulled his brush down just a few times to suggest it? Now, the soft chiffon ruffle at her neckline up here, the sheer sleeves of the dress, the additional ribbons at her elbows, and the overall movement and silkiness of the dress create the very essence of chic confidence here. This is a beautiful dress, made even more so by Sargent's virtuoso handling of the paint. So we've seen a lot of fashion here, and I've taken up a lot of your evening. So we're just going to wrap up with a brief summary of what we've seen tonight. Just this one last slide. Tonight we've seen a wide variety, and I would say a wild variety of fashions through the years. We've considered fine materials and the remarkable skill of the artists that have captured it. Hopefully, tonight's program has given you a better sense of the changing styles through the centuries and the great artists that immortalize them. Thank you. I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about the fashions we've seen.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was so fascinating. It was just every picture showed something different, colors, textures, styles, and so much history behind the fashion and inspiration too, I assume, for fashion designers.
Right.
And people viewing these pictures, I assume, in public places. You mentioned one painting had to be removed because it got people so upset, and also just getting inspired by them as well.
Right.
Thank you. That was fascinating.
My pleasure. Thanks for the kind words that are coming in. I'm getting some direct messages. I appreciate that very much. It is interesting to think, Elizabeth, about how many of these pictures really did create an uproar from Marie Antoinette to John Singer Sargent's Madame X. Like people look at some clothes and they just they can't contain themselves, right?
Yes, I mean, they were challenging, but
Yeah,
nowadays, we look back and have to realize that they were so fashion forward, but
right.
also referencing older styles with what was there before, what's old again, what was old is new again. So that is very interesting.
I think it's probably going to give us all maybe a little bit more pause tomorrow morning when we get dressed, right? Am I
Yeah,
going to wear my floor length pearls? That's really the big question.
thank you so much can be communicated. And I put together a little book display in the library. So with our wonderful fashion books and, paintings of famous people and their fashions. And so people will keep it going for a little while and people can look at that. Are there any questions people have? Still, you can unmute yourself. One question is, do you see these styles in fashion today? Is there any artist
Yeah.
today that can compare?
That's a great question. I have to admit that I'm not as up to date on fashion as I am on painting. But I look at John Singer Sargent's paintings, and it seems like anyone could step out in any of those gowns today and still look like $1 million. Even Mrs. Carl Meyer here, and Lady Agnew, who we just saw before, there's something sort of timeless about a lot of this, but I'm sure, there's also this kind of fascinating correlation between, how the economy is doing and how long and short skirts and dresses go. So, be watching that. I've read once, I remember reading, if the economy is sort of struggling, fashion designers make longer dresses. So pay attention to what's in the stores the next time you're there.
Yeah. And it's just the colors are so vivid. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you can touch it, the textures. It's just incredible talent, these artists.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess people are very happy with the presentation and enjoyed it. And again, we will send out the recording link and upload it to the library's YouTube channel. And also, I want to remind people that Jane did a presentation on Norman Rockwell in December 2023 that can be still viewed on the library's YouTube channel. And I'm planning to have you back, Jane. It's just so fascinating what you can tell us, and you know so much, and we really appreciate it. I thank everybody for joining us this evening. It's so different if you can experience it live, you know, and ask questions directly. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Jane, and I wish you all a very wonderful and relaxing evening still, and maybe be inspired, you know, up from the paintings we have seen. Thank you so much. Good evening.
Take care. Bye.